In this video, we're going to talk about how to face and ultimately conquer your fears. And we're going to be focusing more on social related fears, like putting yourself out there and facing pressure and social anxiety and stuff like that. But first, I want to start this off with a story about a more raw, life or death animal type of fear that happened to me a few years ago that'll give some insight into how to actually do this. So I used to live alone in the forest, where I worked at a fire lookout for half of every year. I did that for 13 years. And sometimes I would have confrontations with dangerous wild animals, like bears and cougars. There was one time when I was in my cabin and I heard my dog barking outside in a way that I could tell that there was some sort of animal that invaded our territory. And whenever that happened, I would run to the door and start yelling in order to try to scare off any possible threats that might endanger my dog. But this time, when I got to the door, I could see that it was a moose in my yard, which gave me a sense of relief for like a couple of seconds because they would normally just run away from my dog. But then I saw my dog chasing after it and it didn't run away, but instead it stood its ground and kicked my dog, which knocked him over and made him start like tumbling. And when he was upside down, the moose stomped on his chest. I thought I was witnessing the death of my dog, like right in front of my eyes. So I ran out yelling to scare the moose away, but I was also aware of the extreme danger that I was putting myself in by going out there. So at first, I stayed within a distance where I could run back into the safety of the cabin if the moose came after me. And this moose was like totally crazy. You know, my dog obviously freaked it out. It looked like it was almost insane. Like it kept making grunting noises and charging towards my dog like it wanted to finish him off. But then it would look up at me and be like a little bit afraid and back off. But I felt that I had to go out and actually scare it off so that I could get my dog back to safety. Otherwise, at any second, he was just going to get killed. So I started running out towards the moose, further away from the safety of my cabin. And at a certain point, I could feel a sort of threshold, like the point where unconsciously I could feel that if the moose came after me, there's no way that I could run away in time. So I was exposed to real danger. And once I passed through this sort of unconscious barrier, it unleashed like a raw animal ferocity in me. You know, like the life or death, fight or flight instinct was triggered inside of me, and I was in vicious fight mode. And I've experienced this a few times before in other confrontations with wild animals, and it's pretty crazy. You know, it's like there's a raw power inside all of us that you might not even be aware is there until the circumstances bring it out of you. And we'll also talk about how this is related to social related fears in a little bit. But basically, I went out and started viciously yelling at the moose as though I was going to run after it and rip its head off with my bare hands. And I scared it away enough so that my dog could limp his way back to the safety of the cabin. And this moose really was crazy. Like after I got back inside, I could hear more grunting noises outside. So I looked out the window and he was repeatedly charging at my cabin. Like he wanted to fight with my entire house. So it definitely was a very dangerous situation. But in the end, my dog survived. But if I didn't face my fear and step past that threshold and into the danger of that situation, then he probably would have been killed or very seriously injured. So when it comes to facing fear, besides everything else that we're going to be talking about, maybe the first lesson is that if you don't step into your fear, then ultimately bad things are going to happen. And this is actually true. Like at the very least, the things that you want to do that you're afraid of are never going to happen. And you're going to miss opportunities and you'll reach the end of your life and regret not taking these kinds of risks. And it often happens that when you avoid doing things that you're afraid of, then it ends up creating a much worse situation. Almost like life punishes you for being a little bitch. So you can use this as a motivating force to help you to face your fears. Like the fact that if you don't do it, then bad things are going to happen to you. But actually, the real reason why I wanted to bring up this story in particular is because of what I mentioned about that sort of unconscious barrier or threshold that I could feel when I approached the moose. This is the fear barrier, and you'll come up to this kind of barrier in any situation that causes fear. So for example, you might have experienced where you're in like some high up place and you start to approach the edge and look down and you feel this very strong feeling of fear that prevents you from going any further. This is a self-protection mechanism, and it's there to prevent you from exposing yourself to danger or possibly even getting killed. So it's there for a reason. And it's the same thing when it comes to social situations and social related fears. Like if you're afraid to talk in front of people or go into certain social environments or put yourself or your ideas out there or any other kind of social related fear, you're also going to run into this same kind of fear barrier. This is also a self-protection mechanism, and it's there to prevent you from exposing yourself to the possible negative judgments and opinions of other people that you might trigger. Because we are a social animal, so we've evolved to be dependent on the group for survival. So if you do something to trigger the group to turn against you, on a deep unconscious level, there's a fear of being like ostracized and left to die alone, or even of being attacked and killed by the group itself. So social fears might seem like they're not really a big deal on the surface, but on the deepest level, it is literally the fear of death. And your unconscious mind can feel the point at which you are going to expose yourself to the possible judgments of other people. So the fear barrier exists to prevent you from doing this and like possibly triggering this kind of wrath of the crowd. And this kind of fear can be very powerful and even crippling. You know, I used to have extreme social anxiety. There's a reason why I lived in the middle of the forest in the first place. Basically, it's kind of like if you try to hold your breath as long as you can, at some point your unconscious mind is going to force you to start breathing again. And when it comes to these kinds of fears, it's exactly the same kind of thing, where your unconscious mind has a similar kind of power and control over you to prevent you from doing what it perceives as danger. But in order to overcome your social fears and build confidence, it's necessary to pass through this kind of fear barrier. In order to overcome your fears, you actually have to face them. Like there's no way around that. But how to do this? Well, before anything else, the first thing to realize is that experiencing fear is actually a good sign. It means that you are approaching the barrier and you have a real intention of actually doing whatever it is that is making you feel the fear. Because if you didn't have the intention of actually doing it, then you probably wouldn't experience any fear at all. Like if you were to imagine in your mind right now, like speaking on a stage in front of thousands of people, you probably don't feel any fear just thinking about that. But if you were actually about to do it, then you would probably feel a lot of fear and maybe even be like completely terrified. And the same is true for any kind of situation. When you actually start to approach it with a real intention of doing it, then you'll start to feel fear. So the fear is actually a good thing, and it means that you're almost ready to do it. But how to actually cross the fear barrier and actually do it? Because even if you're almost ready, you're never going to get to the point when you do feel ready, right? It's just never going to happen. The fear will always be there. So it's necessary to somehow enter into the situation even though the fear is still there. There was one time when I went bungee jumping, and when I stepped up to the edge and looked down and I started to feel the fear, and for a split second I had the feeling that it was like impossible and I wasn't going to be able to do it. But the people working there didn't give me any time to hesitate at all. Like as soon as I stepped up to the edge, they said like, okay, 3, 2, 1, jump, before I even had any time to think at all. It's probably a trick that they learned over time through experience to prevent people from getting stuck in hesitation and help them to plow through this fear barrier. And it works. And there's a lesson to be learned from this as to how to face your social fears. And I'll teach you a method right now that's kind of similar to that, that's worked worked for me in many different situations in life that I call crossing the point of no return. Basically, it's taking some action that forces you into the situation so that you can't back out. So I'll give a few different examples of this from my own life, and then I'll sum it up and give a sort of general way that you can apply this same thing to any kind of situation that involves fear. So first, I'll give a bit of an extreme example just to illustrate how this works. And this is something that I imagine most people have never tried before, basically because it's extremely difficult. And it took me a long time to ever be able to do this because of the crazy amount of fear involved. And what I'm talking about is approaching girls. This is the way that I always meet girls. Like, I never used online dating apps or anything like that. And maybe I'll talk about this in more detail in future videos. But for now, I just need to explain a few details. So I pretty much always approach girls who are walking on the streets. That's how to find like the most attractive girls consistently, usually in the city center of major cities around the world, wherever I happen to be. And the best way to do this is to sort of run up from behind and circle around her and then stop her and give her a compliment and then try to start a conversation. Again, I'm not going to get into all the details right now, but there can be like an insane amount of fear when you do this. But one trick that I've learned is to just start running. Basically, once I start running, something in my mind switches and it's like I've already crossed this point of no return. Like if I were to just stop in the middle of randomly running for a few seconds, then I'll just look like an idiot. So at that point, it's almost more difficult and embarrassing to stop running and chicken out than it is to carry through and approach. And I actually pretty much never chicken out after I start running. So if I focus more on the preliminary action of just starting to run rather than everything that comes after that, then it's a lot easier to actually pull the trigger and go for it. And another example that maybe you've also experienced before is I mentioned earlier that I used to work at a fire tower. So basically I was alone in the middle of the forest, but sometimes I would have to make work-related phone calls. And this used to terrify me, and it would take me a very long time to work up the courage to actually do it. But at one point, I learned a trick where I would just quickly pick up the phone, dial the number, and then hold it to my ear. And sometimes I would be like deathly nervous when it started to ring. But at that point, I basically had no choice because they would see my number on the caller ID. So I couldn't just hang up. And this is something that worked very well. And eventually I overcame my fear of phoning people by doing this. So again, I took a preliminary action that brought me across the point of no return so that I had no way of retreating and I had to carry through with it. Another example is what you're watching right now, this very video itself. I know my last video, I was talking about a bit of a controversial topic about why girls are attracted to dominance. And even though at this point I don't get very many views on my videos, but I was still a little bit afraid when I released that. But what I did was just open up my computer, go to the website, open up the video, and then just quickly press the publish button. And once the button is pressed, then again, it's like a point of no return. Now the video is out there for all to see, including the possible angry Twitter mobs that maybe I'm unconsciously afraid of. And it's the same thing, for example, sending messages to people. You know, I actually do this same kind of thing quite a lot, where I'll write some like slightly controversial or slightly sexual messages to girls, or maybe I'll say something that I think might possibly be too much and maybe get me rejected or something like that. But I do exactly the same thing where I feel fear and I'm kind of worried about what the response might be, but then I just quickly press the send button and then let whatever happens happen. So what do all of these examples have in common? In each one, it's about taking some sort of preliminary action that comes before the thing that I'm afraid of in order to put me in a situation where there's no turning back. And it's a lot easier to focus on this preliminary action action and just do it very quickly and pull the trigger than it is to try to actually overpower the fear barrier just by brute force. And you can take this same idea and apply it to any kind of fear. Like if you are afraid to go into some social environment, for example, don't focus on going into the situation. Just focus on like quickly walking up to the door and opening it and walking inside. And then you're there and you can deal with the situation once you're actually in it. And you can do the same kind of thing for basically any kind of fear that you have. And when you do this, it's very similar to the moose story, where I reached a point of no return, where there was no turning back, where I was exposed and I had no choice left but to unleash my inner ferocity. And the same kind of thing can happen in social situations, where you can build up like crazy amounts of energy and social momentum to the point that you can feel like totally amazing or even indestructible. Like nothing anyone says or does can have any effect on you whatsoever. And if you constantly face your fears, then you will experience this kind of thing. And that brings us to another question. What actually lies on the other side of the barrier of fear? Basically, it's the life that you really want. It's the person that you really want to be. Like it's there waiting for you on the other side of this barrier of fear. But that being said, passing through this barrier is only really the first step. In order to truly conquer your fears, it's not enough to just like face your fear one time and then all of a sudden you're just totally confident. Like we talked about earlier, the reason that you feel fear in the first place is because your unconscious mind is trying to prevent you from facing the kind of pressure or backlash or whatever might happen as a result of that action. So naturally, once you actually do pass through this barrier, then you'll have to actually face that pressure and whatever kind of judgments people might have and any kind of feelings of rejection or embarrassment or whatever else might happen as a result of going through with it. So there's a process that you have to go through to face and digest and adapt to this kind of pressure over time and build up the inner strength to be able to handle it without being so affected by it, so that the things that maybe make you terrified right now can become like not even a big deal. And then you can move on to facing even greater fears and gradually become stronger and more confident. If you want more detailed instructions on how to do all this, then you can check out the link in the description, where you'll find a step-by-step system of training that will take you through this entire process so that you can apply it to all areas of your life. But the point for now, and the point of this video, is that none of this is even possible in the first place without being able to smash through the barriers and face your fear. So for now, I challenge you to go out and do something that you're afraid of. And if anything interesting happens, then you can report back in the comment section. And other than that, I will talk to you in the next video.